What if I told you that before Europeans arrived, Native Americans were growing vegetables so nutritious, so perfectly adapted to this land, that modern science is only now catching up to what indigenous farmers knew centuries ago? You've eaten maybe 20 different vegetables in your entire life. Meanwhile, there were over 200 cultivated by tribes across this continent, and 99% of them have been completely erased from our plates. That's not an accident. In the next 15 minutes, I'm revealing 15 forgotten vegetables that indigenous farmers grew for thousands of years. Vegetables that could survive droughts, resist pests without chemicals, and pack more nutrition than anything sitting in your grocery store right now. Number 11 was so valuable it was used as currency. And the last entry on this list was feeding entire civilizations while Europeans were still figuring out basic crop rotation. Let's get into it. So why did these vegetables disappear? 3 reasons. First, colonization didn't just take land. It destroyed the agricultural knowledge that came with it. Indigenous farming systems were dismissed as primitive, when they were actually sophisticated beyond anything Europeans had seen. Second, industrial agriculture needed uniformity. Crops that could be planted in perfect rows, harvested by machines, and shipped across continents. Indigenous vegetables were bred for nutrition and resilience, not shelf life and appearance. Third, the deliberate destruction of native food systems was policy. Bison were slaughtered to starve plains tribes into submission. Traditional gardens were plowed under. Seeds that families had saved for generations were confiscated or lost when communities were forcibly relocated. But here's why this matters right now. We're facing climate chaos, and our current crops are failing. Droughts are devastating corn. Heat waves are killing lettuce. Pests are evolving faster than pesticides can keep up. Meanwhile, these forgotten vegetables evolved over thousands of years to thrive in exactly the conditions we're now facing. They're drought-tolerant. They're pest-resistant. They don't need fertilizers because they work with the soil instead of depleting it. And they're still out there, waiting. These weren't just side dishes. These vegetables were medicine, they were ceremony, they were survival. And bringing them back could be the most important thing we do for our food future. Let's start with one you've definitely never heard of. Vegetable number 15. Tepary bean. Imagine a bean so drought-resistant it can produce a full harvest on just 3 inches of rainfall. While your garden beans shrivel and die in a dry summer, tepary beans are thriving like nothing happened. The Tohono O'odham, Pima, and other Sonoran desert tribes cultivated tepary beans for over 4,000 years. These small, dense beans come in white, brown, black, and speckled varieties, each with slightly different flavors ranging from sweet and nutty to rich and earthy. Archaeologists have found tepary bean remains in cave sites across Arizona and New Mexico dating back millennia. They weren't just food. They were insurance against the brutal desert climate. Nutritionally, tepary beans are remarkable. They have more protein than common beans, more fiber, and a lower glycemic index, which makes them excellent for managing blood sugar. Studies show they may help prevent diabetes, a disease that disproportionately affects indigenous communities today. So why did they disappear? When irrigation systems brought water to the desert, farmers switched to common beans that produced larger harvests. Tepary beans were dismissed as peasant food. By the 1980s, they had nearly vanished. But now, with water scarcity becoming the crisis of our time, tepary beans are being recognized as exactly what we need. Native seed search and tribal farms are bringing them back. You can actually buy tepary beans online and grow them yourself. They're one of the easiest vegetables to cultivate if you live anywhere with hot, dry summers. Vegetable number 14. Lamb's quarters. Most people spray this plant with herbicides. They call it a weed and rip it out of their gardens. What they don't realize is they're destroying one of the most nutritious greens on the planet. Lamb's quarters, also called goosefoot, was cultivated across North America for thousands of years. Cherokee, Navajo, Iroquois, and dozens of other nations grew it deliberately, harvested the leaves as greens, and collected the tiny seeds as grain. The leaves contain more iron than spinach, more calcium than kale, and more protein than most leafy greens. The seeds were ground into flour or cooked like quinoa, which is actually a close relative. Archaeological evidence shows lamb's quarters seeds in storage pits across the continent, some dating back over 3,500 years. This wasn't an occasional forage find. This was a staple crop. It disappeared because colonizers saw it as a weed. European agriculture had no category for a plant that produced both edible greens and edible grain. So it was plowed under and forgotten. Here's the remarkable thing. Lamb's quarters still grows everywhere. It's probably in your backyard right now. It volunteers in gardens, along roadsides, and in disturbed soil across the entire continent. The difference between a weed and a vegetable is just knowledge. And now you have it. Vegetable number 13. Groundnut. This is not a peanut. The American groundnut is a climbing vine that produces chains of edible tubers underground, like potatoes strung together on a root. And it might be the most underrated vegetable in North American history. Tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast cultivated groundnut for centuries. The tubers are starchy, slightly sweet, and taste like a cross between a potato and a roasted chestnut. They're high in protein, around 15%, which is 3 times more than potatoes. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, they were starving. It was the Wampanoag who showed them how to dig groundnuts from the frozen soil. Without this indigenous vegetable, there might not have been a second Thanksgiving. Historical records from the 1600s describe colonists eating groundnuts regularly. Thomas Jefferson even tried to cultivate them at Monticello. But as European crops took over, groundnuts faded from memory. The problem for industrial agriculture is that groundnuts take 2 to 3 years to produce a full harvest. Patience isn't profitable. But for home gardeners and permaculturists, groundnuts are perfect. Plant them once, and they come back year after year, spreading slowly and producing more tubers each season. They fix nitrogen in the soil, so they actually improve your garden while feeding you. Some specialty nurseries now sell groundnut tubers. They're starting to appear at farmers markets in New England. This is a comeback waiting to happen. Vegetable number 12. Amaranth greens. Everyone knows amaranth grain, the ancient superfood that's in every health food store. But the leaves. Almost nobody eats those anymore. And that's a massive missed opportunity. Indigenous farmers across Mexico and the American Southwest grew amaranth for both its seeds and its greens. The leaves are tender, slightly sweet, and packed with nutrition. More vitamin A than spinach, more vitamin C than tomatoes, and loaded with calcium and iron. Aztec, Mayan, and Puebloan peoples harvested amaranth leaves throughout the growing season while waiting for the grain to mature. It was a dual-purpose crop that maximized every inch of garden space. Here's where history gets dark. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they recognized how central amaranth was to indigenous life and religion. Amaranth grain was used in sacred ceremonies, mixed with honey and sometimes blood to form ritual figures. So the Spanish banned it. Growing amaranth became punishable by death. Fields were burned. Seeds were destroyed. The grain survived in hidden mountain villages. But the practice of eating the greens largely disappeared, replaced by European vegetables that the colonizers understood. Amaranth greens are making a quiet comeback. You can find them at Asian grocery stores, where they're sold as Chinese spinach. And if you grow amaranth for grain, you can harvest leaves all summer long. 1 plant, 2 harvests, 0 waste. That's indigenous agricultural genius. Vegetable number 11. Hog peanut. This one was so valuable that some tribes used it as currency. Hog peanut is a delicate vine that produces 2 types of beans. Small pods above ground and larger, single-seeded pods that bury themselves in the soil. Tribes across the eastern woodlands, including Ojibwe, Menominee, and Potawatomi, harvested hog peanuts every fall. The underground seeds taste like a mix between a chickpea and a raw peanut. They can be eaten fresh, dried, or roasted. But here's the fascinating part. Indigenous harvesters often raided the caches of mice and voles, who collected hog peanuts and stored them in underground burrows. The practice was sustainable. Harvesters would take some of the stored seeds but leave enough for the rodents to survive, and they'd often leave corn or other food as a trade. This was a 3-way relationship between humans, animals, and plants that had existed for thousands of years. Hog peanuts declined because they're small and labor-intensive to harvest. No machine can dig them up. No industrial system wants to partner with mice. But wild hog peanuts still grow in forests across the eastern United States. Foragers who know what to look for can still find them. And a few native plant nurseries are starting to offer seeds. Quick pause. Comment below which of these first 5 vegetables you've actually seen growing in the wild. I'm guessing most of you are at 0. And that's exactly the point. We walk past food every day without recognizing it. We spray it with poison, mow it down, and pave it over. And then we complain that eating healthy is too expensive. The knowledge was there. The plants are still there. What's missing is connection. All right. The next 5 get even more interesting. Vegetable number 10. Wild hyacinth bulb. Also called camas. This was the most important root vegetable west of the Rocky Mountains. Entire economies were built around it. Nez Perce, Salish, Shoshone, and dozens of other tribes managed vast camas meadows, burning them regularly to prevent trees from encroaching and to boost bulb production. The harvest was so significant that it structured the entire year. Families would travel to camas grounds, set up camps, and dig for weeks. The bulbs look like small onions but taste completely different. When slow roasted in earth ovens for up to 72 hours, the starches convert to fructose, creating a sweet, caramelized vegetable that could be dried and stored for months. Lewis and Clark wrote extensively about camas. Their expedition nearly starved until Nez Perce families fed them camas and salmon. So why did camas disappear? Camas meadows were some of the most fertile land in the Pacific Northwest. Settlers saw flat, treeless ground and turned it into farmland. The meadows were plowed. The bulbs were destroyed. And the carefully managed fire regimes that maintained them were suppressed. Today, camas is making a slow comeback through indigenous-led restoration projects. Some tribes are reclaiming ancestral meadows and reintroducing traditional burns. You can find camas bulbs at native plant sales, though they take 3 to 5 years to mature. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, planting camas in your yard isn't just gardening. It's restoration. Vegetable number 9. Cattail. You've seen this plant 1,000 times. Tall stalks with brown fuzzy tops growing in every marsh, pond, and roadside ditch across North America. What you probably don't know is that cattail was called the supermarket of the swamp, because almost every part of it is edible. And indigenous peoples knew exactly how to use all of it. Ojibwe, Paiute, Apache, and tribes across the entire continent harvested cattails year-round. In spring, the young shoots taste like cucumber and can be eaten raw or cooked. In early summer, the green flower heads can be boiled and eaten like corn on the cob. The pollen, collected in late summer, was used as protein-rich flour. And the starchy roots, available year-round, were roasted, dried, and ground into meal. 1 acre of cattails can produce more edible starch than 1 acre of potatoes. Let that sink in. Archaeological sites across North America show cattail pollen and root fibers in cooking areas dating back over 7,000 years. This wasn't occasional foraging. This was systematic harvesting of a plant that provided food in every season. So why did cattails become just a weed? Wetlands were drained. Marshes were filled. The places where cattails thrived were seen as wastelands to be converted into farmland or development. And the knowledge of how to harvest and prepare them disappeared along with the wetlands. Here's the comeback. Cattails are aggressive survivors. They're actually spreading as climate change creates more flooding and disturbed wetlands. Foragers and survival experts are rediscovering them. Some permaculture farms are deliberately cultivating cattail marshes. You probably have cattails growing within a mile of your home right now. Free food, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to remember what it's for. Vegetable number 8. Miner's lettuce. This succulent green grows wild across the western United States, and it saved lives during the California gold rush. Miners suffering from scurvy discovered that eating these round, delicate leaves cured them within days. But indigenous Californians knew about miner's lettuce long before any gold rush. Miwok, Pomo, Ohlone, and other tribes gathered it every spring as one of the first fresh greens of the season. The entire plant is edible: leaves, stems, and flowers, with a mild, slightly sweet flavor. 1 cup of miner's lettuce contains about a third of your daily vitamin C requirement. It's also high in vitamin A, iron, and omega-3 fatty acids, which is rare for a leafy green. The Spanish missions suppressed indigenous gathering practices and converted native landscapes to European-style agriculture. Miner's lettuce was dismissed as wild forage, not a real vegetable. Today, it's being rediscovered by chefs and foragers. It grows easily in cool, moist conditions and actually prefers shade, making it perfect for spaces where other vegetables struggle. You can find miner's lettuce seeds from specialty suppliers. It self-sows readily, so one planting can establish a permanent patch that returns every spring. Vegetable number 7. Wapato. Drop a fire emoji if you've never heard of this one, because wapato might be the most important forgotten vegetable in North America. Also called Indian potato or arrowhead, wapato is an aquatic plant that grows in shallow wetlands across the continent. The tubers that form underwater are starchy, nutritious, and taste similar to potatoes with a hint of chestnut. 4 tribes along the Columbia River, the Great Lakes, and countless waterways in between, wapato was a staple food. Chinook, Ojibwe, and many others harvested it by wading into cold water and loosening the tubers with their toes, then collecting them as they floated to the surface. Lewis and Clark traded for wapato constantly during their expedition. They wrote that it was as important to the local diet as bread was to Europeans. Here's what happened. Wetlands were drained for agriculture. Swamps were filled for development. And the cultural knowledge of how to harvest wapato, when to gather it, how to prepare it, faded as communities were displaced from their ancestral waters. Wapato still grows in wetlands that remain. Conservation groups are protecting some sites. And a few native plant nurseries sell wapato tubers for water gardens and wetland restoration. If you have a pond, a bog garden, or any wet area on your property, you could be growing one of the most historically significant vegetables on the continent. Vegetable number 6. Wild ginger. Not the Asian ginger you see in stores. This is a completely different plant, native to the forests of eastern North America, and it was medicine and food wrapped into one. Cherokee, Iroquois, Chippewa, and other woodland tribes used wild ginger root to flavor foods, settle stomachs, treat respiratory infections, and ease menstrual pain. The heart-shaped leaves and strange ground-level flowers were familiar sights in old-growth forests. The roots have a spicy, aromatic flavor, similar to commercial ginger but earthier and more complex. They were dried, ground, and used as seasoning throughout the year. Wild ginger disappeared with the forests. Old-growth woodlands were logged. The deep shade and rich soil that wild ginger needs became rare, and the knowledge of how to use it passed away with elders who were never asked. There's good news. Wild ginger is a beautiful ground cover that's gaining popularity in shade gardens. Native plant nurseries sell it for landscaping. Most people plant it for the attractive leaves and don't realize the roots are edible and medicinal. You can grow wild ginger in any shady, moist spot. It spreads slowly into dense mats. And once you have it, you have a forever supply of homegrown spice. These last 5 vegetables aren't just forgotten. They're endangered. Not because they can't grow, but because we've destroyed the places where they once thrived and the people who knew how to tend them. If we lose these, we lose knowledge that took thousands of years to develop. And we might need that knowledge more than we realize. Vegetable number 5. Ramps. Ramps are having a moment right now. Trendy restaurants charge premium prices for them every spring. Foragers guard their secret patches like treasure. But most people don't know that ramps were a critical early spring food for tribes across Appalachia and the Great Lakes. Cherokee, Ojibwe, and many others relied on ramps as one of the first green vegetables after a long winter. The flavor is intense, like a cross between garlic and onion but more pungent. Ramps are rich in vitamins A and C, and they were used to treat colds, coughs, and to purify the blood after months of stored foods. Here's the problem. Ramps grow slowly. They take 5 to 7 years to reach maturity from seed, and they're being over-harvested. The same trendiness that's bringing attention to ramps is also threatening wild populations. Some states have started regulating ramp harvesting. Indigenous food sovereignty organizations are calling for sustainable practices, taking only what you need, never harvesting entire patches, and leaving bulbs in the ground to regenerate. If you want to eat ramps, the most ethical approach is to grow your own. It takes patience. But ramps planted today could feed your grandchildren. That's the kind of long-term thinking indigenous agriculture always understood. Vegetable number 4. Prairie turnip. On the Great Plains, where trees were scarce and droughts were common, the prairie turnip was a lifeline. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other plains tribes dug these starchy roots every summer, braiding the tops together into strings that hung in lodges and dried for winter storage. The roots are dense, slightly sweet, and can be ground into flour that lasts for years without spoiling. Prairie turnip flour was mixed with berries and fat to make wasna, a concentrated survival food. Lewis and Clark wrote about prairie turnips being traded at gatherings that brought together tribes from hundreds of miles away. They were that valuable. The destruction of the buffalo herds disrupted plains life so completely that many traditional practices, including prairie turnip harvest, were lost within a generation. The plants still grow wild on remnant prairies, but they're rare, and few people remember how to use them. Some tribes are now cultivating prairie turnips deliberately, reviving seeds that survived in forgotten gardens and scattered wild populations. This is resurrection happening in real time. Vegetable number 3. Devil's Club. This plant is covered in spines. It grows in the darkest, wettest corners of Pacific Northwest rainforests, and it was one of the most sacred plants to Tlingit, Haida, and other coastal nations. The young shoots, harvested in early spring before the spines harden, are edible. They taste like a bitter, medicinal version of celery. But Devil's Club was valued more for medicine than food. The bark was used to treat everything from arthritis to diabetes, and the plant held spiritual power for protection and purification. Devil's Club cannot be cultivated commercially. It only grows in intact old-growth rainforest, and those forests are being logged. When we lose old-growth forest, we don't just lose trees. We lose the entire ecosystem of plants that only grow in those conditions. Devil's Club is one of them. Some indigenous communities are fighting to protect Devil's Club habitat as part of broader efforts to preserve ancestral lands. The plant can't be saved without saving the forest. And the forest can't be saved without honoring the people who have protected it for millennia. Vegetable number 2. Biscuit root. High in the mountains and across the sagebrush deserts, biscuit root was the bread of the Great Basin. Paiute, Shoshone, and Bannock peoples dug the thick taproots, pounded them into flour, and made dense cakes that could sustain travelers across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. The flavor is earthy, slightly bitter, and incredibly filling. Biscuit root is high in carbohydrates, fiber, and minerals essential for survival in a demanding landscape. Lewis and Clark traded for biscuit root cakes and wrote that they were better than any bread they'd eaten in the United States. The decline of biscuit root came from overgrazing. Cattle and sheep devoured the plants and compacted the soil where they grew. Mining operations scarred the mountain meadows, and the forced relocations of Great Basin tribes severed the connection between people and the plants they had tended for generations. Wild biscuit root still grows in remote areas, but it's not cultivated anywhere. The knowledge of how to sustainably harvest, process, and store it survives only with elders in a handful of communities. This is extinction happening in slow motion, and most people have no idea. Vegetable number 1. Osha. Also called bare root, osha is the final vegetable, and it represents everything at stake. Osha grows only in high mountain meadows, above 9,000 feet, in the Rocky Mountains. The root has an intense, complex flavor, spicy, bitter, and aromatic. Navajo, Ute, Apache, and other mountain tribes used it as food, as medicine, and as protection. The roots were chewed to prevent infection, brewed into tea for respiratory illness, and carried as spiritual protection on dangerous journeys. When a bear emerged from hibernation, the first thing it would do was dig osha roots. Indigenous peoples watched and learned. The bear knew. Osha cannot be cultivated. Every attempt has failed. It only grows wild in specific conditions, at specific elevations, in specific soils that scientists still don't fully understand. And it's being over-harvested. The demand for osha as herbal medicine has exploded, but the supply is finite. Poachers are raiding wild populations. And climate change is pushing OSHA's habitat higher and higher up the mountains. Within a generation, wild OSHA could be gone. Some tribes have closed access to ancestral OSHA gathering grounds. They're trying to protect what remains. But they're fighting against market forces that don't care about sustainability and climate shifts that no one can control. When OSHA disappears, it won't be because the plant failed. It will be because we failed the plant. So what do? Here's what's working. Indigenous-led seed banks are preserving varieties that commercial agriculture ignored. Tribal farms are cultivating forgotten vegetables and teaching the next generation. Food sovereignty organizations are fighting for the right to grow, harvest, and eat traditional foods. Here's what you can do. First, grow at least one of these vegetables yourself. Tepary beans, amaranth, groundnuts. These are available right now from native plant nurseries and seed libraries. Every plant grown is knowledge preserved. Second, support indigenous food organizations directly. Buy from native-owned farms and businesses. Donate to seed-saving projects. Show up for land-back movements that return stolen territory to tribal stewardship. Third, learn the plants around you. What's growing in your region that indigenous people once cultivated? What knowledge has survived? Find foraging groups, take ethnobotany classes, and connect with people who still carry this wisdom. Fourth, share this information. Every conversation matters. Every time you tell someone about tepary beans or wapato or biscuit root, you're fighting against forgetting. Every single one of these vegetables represents thousands of years of knowledge. When we grow them, we're not just gardening. We're participating in a relationship with this land that existed long before us and could continue long after. We're repairing something that was deliberately broken. We're feeding ourselves in ways that don't destroy the future. And we're honoring the people who figured all this out when the rest of the world wasn't paying attention. One more thing. There's a 16th vegetable I didn't include. It's so endangered and its remaining habitat so fragile that even naming it could put the last populations at risk. The fact that we've reached a point where knowledge has to be hidden to protect what little remains should tell you everything about why this work matters. If you want a part 2 covering forgotten native grains and seeds, the crops that literally built civilizations, destroy that like button and subscribe. Which vegetable are you growing first? Comment below. I'll see you in the next one.